Imagine this. It's October 29th, 2009. The sky over Cleveland is dark, heavy with the promise of rain. A simple phone call would lead to the discovery of a nightmare, one so horrifying that it would change this city forever. Behind the seemingly ordinary walls of a neglected house on Imperial Avenue, police would uncover not one, not two, but dozens of bodies, decaying and forgotten, victims whose screams had gone unheard. But this story isn't just about the monster who did it. It's about a city's failure to act. How many victims could have been saved if the police had listened earlier? Stay with us till the end to hear the chilling twist no one saw coming. Make sure to subscribe to Everything Crime, because you don't want to miss more true crime stories like this one. The city of Cleveland had always been gritty, a place where crime ran rampant, and the cracks in society were wide enough to swallow anyone who didn't have the strength to climb out. It was late October 2009, the air thick with the smell of rain and decay. The sky was a blanket of gray clouds, heavy and ominous, as if the heavens themselves knew that something terrible was about to unfold. Mount Pleasant was one of Cleveland's poorest neighborhoods, a place where houses stood like abandoned shells, many left to rot from neglect. In the years leading up to this moment, it had become a haven for the city's forgotten, those who lived in the shadows, unnoticed by society. Women, black and impoverished, had gone missing from these streets, vanishing without a trace. The city's response? Indifference. But on the cusp of Halloween, that indifference would come to a screeching halt. It was a phone call, one that would shake Cleveland to its very core, that would change everything. It began with a smell. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, but it grew worse with time. People thought it was a dead animal caught in the sewer, or perhaps a rotting pile of trash. It was the kind of thing you could ignore at first. But when the smell grew stronger, even the toughest of the neighborhood residents began to grow uneasy. The scent lingered in the air, heavy, rancid, impossible to escape. It was the kind of smell that gnawed at your senses, invading your home and staying with you, even when you tried to forget it. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was unsettling. Neighbors began to complain. They shut their windows. They burned incense. They sprayed air fresheners. But nothing worked. The odor of decay, of death, hung over Mount Pleasant like a dark cloud. But no one in the community, had any idea just how close they were to the source. And then, women began to disappear. At least 11 women had gone missing from Cleveland by October 2009. All of them were marginalized by society, drug addicts, homeless, neglected. They had no one looking for them. They were the women no one cared about, and their disappearances went unnoticed by the authorities. It was as though they had simply slipped through the cracks, like so many before them. These women were forgotten. But they weren't the only ones. Cleveland had a long history of disappearing people, especially those who lived on the fringes. The missing were often written off as lost causes. The police shrugged, and society moved on. Yet, with each missing woman, the terror grew. Each woman was a life snuffed out, a voice silenced. How many of them had called for help? How many had struggled before they were taken? They were all from different walks of life, yet they shared one thing in common. They were the most vulnerable members of society, people others didn't care about. Do you think the police should have investigated sooner? How many lives could have been saved if someone had just paid attention? It wasn't until one woman's escape that the police were finally forced to listen. On the afternoon of October 29, 2009, a woman, frantic, bruised, and terrified, burst into the Cleveland police station. Her name was Gladys Wade. She was barely able to catch her breath as she described the horrors she had just endured. She told officers that she had been held captive in a house on Imperial Avenue. The man who had done this to her? Anthony Sowell, a name that would soon be forever tied to a nightmare that no one could have ever imagined. She spoke of being attacked, strangled, and nearly killed. She spoke of the stench inside the house, the same stench that had haunted the neighborhood for months. She spoke of other women who had not been so lucky as her. And she spoke of her desperate escape, her fight for survival. Her story was the spark that lit the fire of a police investigation. But it was also the first sign that Cleveland was about to face its darkest hour. The house at 12205 Imperial Avenue didn't look special. It was a dilapidated two-story building, with peeling paint, a front yard littered with trash, and windows tightly covered by curtains. It blended in with the other rundown homes on the block, barely noticeable. But behind those walls, a monster lived. A man who had turned his home into a prison, a graveyard, a house of death. The neighbors had long been suspicious of Anthony Sowell. They had heard the strange noises, screams, thuds, and loud crashes that echoed into the night. But they never said anything. People learned to mind their own business in Mount Pleasant. What could they do? No one had the strength to confront the darkness that seemed to permeate the air. Sowell's house stood like a silent sentinel, its secrets locked behind closed doors. No one knew what happened inside. But they would soon find out. With a search warrant in hand, the police moved in. The first officer to step inside recoiled as the smell hit him, an overwhelming stench so foul it made him vomit on the doorstep. He had never smelled anything like it before. Inside, the house was dark and chaotic, filthy and disorganized. The living room was littered with trash, beer cans, and cigarette butts. But the real horror was in the air, the smell of rotting flesh, blood, and decay. The officers could feel the weight of it, suffocating them as they stepped further into the house. As they split up to search, one officer opened a door leading to the kitchen. Inside, black plastic bags were piled up, each one bulging as if it contained something too horrible to comprehend. Another officer opened the door to the basement, and a swarm of flies poured out. The stench was unbearable. Then in the bedroom, they found the first body, a woman, her eyes wide open in the shock of death, her skin darkened by decomposition. The officers screamed as they discovered two more bodies, one hidden beneath an old mattress, the other wrapped in plastic, her life snuffed out in the most violent way imaginable. By now, you can probably feel the tension building. But we're only just scratching the surface. How could no one have known what was going on inside this house? What would have happened if Gladys Wade hadn't escaped? Would Sowell still be out there, killing without anyone knowing? I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about how long it took for the police to take action? Was there something they could have done earlier to save these women? Cleveland's darkest secret had finally been unveiled, but what the police uncovered inside 12205 Imperial Avenue was beyond comprehension. As officers continued their search through the house, they encountered scenes that were impossible to process. Rooms that had become tombs, bodies abandoned and forgotten in a house that had turned into a horrifying graveyard. The house, once a home, had become a prison of terror for the women Anthony Sowell had tortured, held captive, and ultimately killed. In the kitchen, the stench was unbearable. The black plastic bags that had once been packed away carefully were now left to rot in plain sight. Each bag, bulging and swollen, screamed of what lay inside, human remains. When one officer bravely stepped forward to open one of these bags, the sickening truth came to light. Inside was a body, its skin faded and slick with the fluids of death. But that wasn't the worst of it. As the forensic team combed through the house, they found more. In the basement, the door opened to reveal a horrifying sight. A swarm of flies erupted from the darkness, clouding the air with a sickly buzz. The officers recoiled, their stomachs lurching, but they pressed on, determined to uncover the truth of what had happened in this place. The basement floor was littered with more bags, each one containing pieces of the women Sowell had taken. Fragments of lives now reduced to the grotesque remnants of his monstrous actions. How could a man do this to another human being? What kind of mind could look at someone and see nothing more than an object to destroy, to claim as their own? As the search continued, officers ventured into the bedroom, the place where Sowell had spent his nights, the place where he had turned his home into a living nightmare. It was a scene of horror beyond words. The mattress was stained with dried blood, the mark of violence so profound that it seemed to seep into the very fibers of the bed. Beneath the bed, in the dark shadows that no one had dared to inspect, lay a human skeleton, wrapped tightly in plastic. The body had been left to decay, a silent witness to the horror that had unfolded over the years. Do you ever wonder what it's like to live among the bodies of your victims? What kind of monster can sleep at night in a bed covered with the blood of those he's destroyed? The police hadn't just discovered bodies. They had uncovered the methodical, calculated ways in which Sowell had carried out his crimes. He didn't just kill on impulse. He had turned his home into a prison, carefully selecting his victims and keeping them alive just long enough to make them suffer. His house was not just a place where people died. It was where they were broken down mentally, physically, and emotionally. It became clear, Sowell had not been a random killer. He was a predator who preyed on the most vulnerable women in society, offering them something they desperately needed: attention, affection, maybe even a false sense of safety, before taking it all away in the most violent way possible. What kind of person does this? How does a human being become so detached from the world that they could commit such unspeakable acts and feel no remorse? Then, the worst discovery came. One officer, while carefully navigating the cluttered basement, kicked something soft. It was a body part, an arm, stripped of flesh and reduced to bone. The officer's blood ran cold as he stepped back, his mind racing. What kind of monster would do this to a human being? What kind of man could take someone's life, chop them apart, and leave their remains scattered like discarded trash? The forensic team immediately began to gather more evidence. They found jewelry, wallets, and other personal belongings scattered across the house. These belonged to the missing women, their lives reduced to items tossed aside. As they continued to search, they found something even more disturbing. In the basement, stacks of garbage bags were piled high. Some had been chewed open by rats, revealing decomposing remains. But one bag stood out. It was different from the others. When the police slowly opened it, the gruesome truth was revealed. Inside was a severed head, eyes wide open, staring into the abyss as though it had never truly left the pain and terror of its final moments. Can you imagine walking into a room like that? How would you even begin to process what you're seeing? How would you live with the knowledge that these women's screams had been ignored for so long? Among the many findings, there was one that made the officer's blood run even colder: a long iron chain. It had been fastened to the wall in the basement, used to restrain Sowell's victims. It was clear that Sowell hadn't just been killing randomly. He was holding his victims captive, torturing them both physically and psychologically. The chain spoke of the horror these women endured. They weren't just murdered, they were enslaved, trapped in a place where death was their only escape. How long had these women been held captive in this house? What horrors had they experienced before their final breath? How much could one human being endure before their spirit broke? It wasn't just the bodies that revealed Sowell's true nature. As the investigation continued, the police discovered a series of videotapes hidden in the house. These weren't just any tapes, they were documentaries about other serial killers. It was clear that Sowell hadn't just been inspired by these killers. He had studied them, learned from them, and had become a monster himself. Could it be that Sowell had planned every step of his killings, every move, every victim? Did he see himself as part of a larger group of monsters, learning how to perfect his craft by studying others? We can't ignore the chilling facts. Sowell didn't act on impulse. His actions were planned, calculated, and ruthless. How do you think someone like this becomes who they are? Can anyone truly predict when a person will turn into a monster? Or is it something that lies dormant, waiting to be awakened? As disturbing as it was, the police were still far from the truth. Sowell had been on their radar long before they raided his house. In fact, in 2008, a woman named Gladys Wade had managed to escape from his clutches. She had given a detailed account of the violence she had suffered at Sowell's hands. But the police didn't act. They didn't search his home, and Sowell was free to continue his reign of terror for another year. How could the authorities have missed this? How many more women had to disappear before someone took action? Why did they dismiss Wade's claims, even when there was blood on Sowell's doorstep? After the raid, Sowell vanished. The police launched an intense manhunt, desperate to find the monster who had killed so many. But Sowell wasn't like most criminals. He knew how to evade capture. He had military training, and he had spent years learning how to survive off the grid. For days, he was the most wanted man in America. His disappearance gripped the city. People locked their doors. Women were afraid to go out alone. The fear in Cleveland was palpable. And yet, despite the police's best efforts, Sowell slipped through their fingers, until one fateful night. The city of Cleveland had never felt a fear quite like this. The streets, which had once been bustling with life, were now eerily quiet. People locked themselves inside their homes, double-checking locks, pulling down curtains, and avoiding the streets after dark. The fear of the unknown gripped the city's heart. Was Sowell still out there, lurking in the shadows, planning his next move? Was he watching the police, waiting for them to slip up? For 3 long days, Anthony Sowell became the most wanted man in America. The police launched an all-out manhunt, sweeping the streets, searching abandoned houses, and scanning surveillance footage. Sowell, with his military training and methodical mind, knew how to cover his tracks. He wasn't just hiding, he was waiting. He had been trained to disappear, to blend into the environment, and to evade capture. Each day that passed, the people of Cleveland grew more and more desperate. Sowell wasn't just a fugitive, he was a living nightmare. A monster who had evaded justice for too long. How would you have felt if you were living in Cleveland at that time? What would you have done to protect yourself and your family from a monster who could be lurking just around the corner? On the 4th day of the manhunt, the breakthrough came from the unlikeliest of places. A bar employee working a late shift near downtown Cleveland. While working, the employee spotted a man with a distinctive scar on his face, walking slowly, almost aimlessly. The man appeared disoriented, his clothes dirty, his eyes blank. It didn't take long for the employee to recognize him. The man was Anthony Sowell. The employee, not hesitating for a second, immediately called the police. The tip was passed to the authorities, and within minutes, a team of SWAT officers was dispatched to the scene. The news spread like wildfire. Anthony Sowell had been spotted, and the police were closing in. How do you think the bar employee felt when they realized they were looking at the man responsible for such brutal killings? Do you think they had a moment of doubt, or did they know they had to act immediately? Sowell's capture was swift. Within 15 minutes of the tip-off, SWAT officers surrounded him. The scene was chaotic, but the officers were well prepared. As they approached Sowell, he showed no resistance. In fact, he remained eerily calm, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. When they asked him if he was Anthony Sowell, he denied it at first, insisting that he wasn't the man they were searching for. But as the officers began to fingerprint him, the truth was undeniable. The prints matched, and his identity was confirmed. Can you imagine the coldness of Sowell's demeanor as the officers closed in on him? How could a man who had committed such horrific acts remain so calm, even in the face of his capture? Was it a sign of his true nature? Once Sowell was in custody, the city of Cleveland breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster was no longer hiding in plain sight. But the relief was short-lived. As the trial began, the full extent of Sowell's horrors became clear, and the city was forced to face the truth of what had happened within the walls of 12205 Imperial Avenue. The trial was a spectacle. Journalists flooded the courthouse. The families of the victims sat in the front row, their faces etched with pain and disbelief. They had waited for this moment for years, the moment when the man who had taken their loved ones' lives would be forced to answer for his crimes. In the courtroom, Sowell was calm, almost too calm. He sat with his arms crossed, showing no emotion as the evidence was presented. Photographs of the victims, the bodies discovered in the house, and the chilling tapes found on Sowell's property played on a large screen for all to see. It was a gruesome reminder of the terror he had caused. What do you think it was like for the victims' families to see Sowell in court, knowing that this man was the one who had stolen their loved ones from them? Do you think they found any sense of closure in the trial, or was it just another form of torment? As the trial continued, Sowell's chilling indifference only deepened the family's pain. When asked about the murders, he showed no remorse. His responses were cold and calculated. "What's done is done," he said when asked if he felt any regret. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For the families of the victims, this was a final slap in the face. Their pain, their loss, had been ignored, dismissed by the one person who had caused it. Sowell's lack of emotion, his complete absence of humanity, sent shockwaves through the room. How would you react if you were one of the family members, sitting in that courtroom, listening to Sowell shrug off the pain and suffering he had caused? Could you find it in yourself to forgive him, or would his lack of remorse only deepen your grief? After weeks of testimony and mounting evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Anthony Sowell was found guilty of 82 counts, including murder, kidnapping, and abuse of corpses. The judge handed down a death sentence, and the courtroom erupted in emotion. Some of the victims' families wept, grateful that Sowell would never hurt anyone again. Others were less sure. Justice had been served, but could it ever truly be enough to undo the suffering he had caused? Do you think justice was truly served with Sowell's conviction? Was the death sentence enough, or was it too late for the victims' families to ever feel like they had closure? Though Sowell was convicted and sentenced to death, he would never face the execution that many had hoped for. He spent the next several years appealing his sentence, dragging out the process in a way that only added to the suffering of his victims' families. Finally, on February 8, 2021, Anthony Sowell died in prison. But it wasn't execution that ended his life. It was cancer. Sowell died quietly, without the public spectacle many had expected. No dramatic final moments, no fiery end to the nightmare he had caused. He simply passed away in a prison cell, alone. For the victims' families, Sowell's death brought little solace. Some felt it was unfair. He had lived for so long without facing the full consequences of his actions. Others felt that his quiet death was almost fitting. Sowell had lived among the dead for so long. Perhaps it was only right that he should pass away without anyone witnessing it. Do you think Sowell deserved to die quietly in prison, or should he have faced a public execution for his horrific crimes? How do you think his victims' families felt about his final moments? Even after his death, the scars left by Anthony Sowell remained in Cleveland. The house at 12205 Imperial Avenue, where so much pain had been inflicted, was eventually torn down in 2011. The rubble was carted away, but the memory of what happened inside that house would never be erased. For the victims' families, the demolition felt like the final step in an attempt to erase the horror. But no matter how much the city tried to bury it, the memory of Sowell's crimes lingered, a dark shadow over Cleveland's history. What do you think it means for a city to have a place like Sowell's house, the House of Horrors, destroyed? Can we ever truly erase the memories of such evil, or does it stay with us, haunting our thoughts forever? Cleveland, Ohio, will forever be haunted by the events that transpired in that old, decaying house on Imperial Avenue. When the authorities finally raided the home of Anthony Sowell, they unearthed horrors that shook the entire city, and the world. But even after his capture, trial, and eventual death, there were still questions left unanswered. How many victims had Sowell truly claimed? How many more were still out there, their stories lost to time? And perhaps most haunting of all, how had Sowell managed to live among the dead, year after year, without anyone suspecting the truth? The house was demolished in 2011, the physical reminder of Sowell's reign of terror reduced to rubble. Yet, for the families of the victims, the emotional scars would never disappear. No amount of demolition could erase the memories of the horrors those walls had witnessed. No legal sentence, no matter how severe, could ever bring back the lives that were lost. For the victims' families, the pain of losing their loved ones to a man who had preyed on their vulnerability was immense. Some had never received closure, never had the chance to say goodbye, and for many, the journey for justice felt incomplete. They had fought to have their voices heard during the trial, but even after Sowell's conviction, there were lingering questions. The victims were not just statistics or faceless individuals in a news report. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. People with stories, dreams, and lives that were taken too soon. And yet, their deaths had often been treated as insignificant by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The aftermath of this case left Cleveland grappling with its own shortcomings. How many times had the police dismissed reports of missing women, assuming they were just lost causes? How many warning signs had been ignored? The case revealed a dark truth that many were unwilling to face. The city's most vulnerable, homeless women, women of color, those with addiction issues, were the ones most often overlooked and forgotten. The question haunted the city long after the trial ended. How many victims were there really? Looking back on this case, do you think the police and the justice system failed to protect these women? If Sowell's first victim had been taken seriously sooner, how many lives could have been saved? In the years following Sowell's conviction and death, the story of his crimes continued to haunt Cleveland's consciousness. Many believed that his passing, caused by cancer in 2021, was too quiet, too understated. The city had wanted him to suffer, to feel the same pain and fear that his victims had endured. His death, which came in the silence of a prison cell, felt like a cruel twist of fate. He had stolen so many lives, Yet his final moments were marked by an absence of the suffering many had hoped for. Was his death justice? Or did it somehow feel like the final insult, a man who had wreaked havoc for years, slipping away quietly in the night without the pain he had caused? Do you believe that Sowell's death in prison was fitting, or would a public execution have been a more fitting end? Would it have given the victims' families a sense of closure? As Cleveland moved on, trying to heal from the wounds Sowell had inflicted, the question remained, what did we learn from this nightmare? The case of Anthony Sowell was a brutal reminder of the cost of ignoring the most vulnerable in society. These women were easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as lost causes. But they weren't just statistics. They were people, and each one of them had a family, a history, a life that was stolen from them. The authorities had failed to act in time to save them, but their stories should never be forgotten. What happened in that house on Imperial Avenue is a painful chapter in Cleveland's history, but it is also a call to action. It's a warning that we cannot afford to ignore those on the margins. The case showed the importance of paying attention to the missing, the homeless, the addicted, and making sure their stories are heard, their pain acknowledged. Though Sowell's death may have closed one chapter, it did not erase the pain of the families who had lost their loved ones. The haunting truth remains. The city of Cleveland, the police, and society as a whole had allowed this man to operate freely for far too long. But now, with Sowell's story laid bare, it is up to the people of Cleveland, and the world, to ensure that his victims are remembered not just as lost souls, but as human beings whose lives mattered. In the end, Anthony Sowell's capture, trial, and eventual death are reminders of the darkest corners of humanity, but also of the strength of those who survived and fought for justice. His name will live on in infamy, but it is the names of his victims, the mothers, daughters, and sisters, who should never be forgotten. And so, the case of Anthony Sowell is closed, at least for now. But there are still unanswered questions. How many other victims did Sowell have? Were there others like him, operating in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike? The truth may never be fully known, but the lesson remains. We must be vigilant, we must fight for those who are most vulnerable, and we must never forget the price of indifference. The house on Imperial Avenue is gone. The man who turned it into a house of horrors is dead. But the memory of what happened there, of the lives that were lost, remains a testament to the darkness that can thrive when society chooses to look away. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey into Cleveland's darkest secrets. Don't forget to subscribe to Everything Crime for more true crime stories that you won't want to miss. What do you think? How can we ensure that no one is ever forgotten again? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, justice is not just about punishment. It's about remembering the victims, the lives they lived, and the stories that need to be heard.